Hello, developmental psychopathology class. My name is Sabina, and I'm going to be talking today about social anxiety. Specifically, I read an article, a study on the trajectories of social anxiety and relations with cognition, competence, and temperament. I put a little citation there for you. Check it out if you want to read more. Um, so the study was done in the Netherlands. Um, they had two main questions they wanted to answer. The first being they wanted to identify trajectories of social anxiety across the whole adolescent period. So, um, is there a way to isolate people in different with different levels of social anxiety and look at trajectories of that from onset, around early adolescence to kind of the end of the adolescent period, early adulthood. They had looked at many different studies, found that some had discovered two being low and high levels of social anxiety. Some had discovered up to six, being high and changing, moderate and decreasing, and lots of variables in there. And then secondly, they wanted to answer which of the they wanted to look at variables that discriminate between social anxiety trajectories. So they looked at cognition, social competence, and temperament as the variables. Um, they did this so that they could. They are the first study to examine the trajectory of social anxiety over the whole adolescent period, and to look at what variables are associated with that trajectory. And understanding this can what lead to high social anxiety can definitely inform intervention and treatment. What is social anxiety? Our textbook says it's the marked and persistent fear of social performance situations in which scrutiny or embarrassment might occur. Um, Comes on in early adolescence, typically 10 to 13 years old. The most common fears of social anxiety are reading aloud and unstructured social situations like lunchtime. My son has social anxiety, and he has his is really field trips. That's a very unstructured social time for him, where it's unpredictable social time for him. He doesn't know what's going to be expected and is very worried about them. And we've had a lot of incidents around that. Where does it come from? It's 50% inherited, thought to be 50% inherited. Um, and, and then there's classical conditioning. So if you're standing in front of your class, reading aloud, and the it's going poorly, you're blushing, you're stuttering, you will likely feel bad about it yourself inside. Peers will not be very kind about that, or perhaps you get a bad grade. Anyway, you get positive reinforcement for having anxiety about that situation. And then a lot of parent-child interactions contribute to this as well. So if the parents are controlling, overprotective, hostile, critical, all of those are factors. If your parents have social anxiety, it's a modeling. And then if they are also avoidant of emotional conversations, that's a skill that is not learned or learned to be feared. Um, the variables that they looked at were cognition, social competence, and temperament. With cognition, particularly self-focused attention. So when you enter uh, when social anxiety is being experienced, they, instead of looking externally for social cues, they look internally and pay attention to their internal thoughts. Self-evaluation of performance, so feeling poor about a performance that you did, having a lot of anxiety around that. Could be public speaking, could be just answering a math question, could be um, uh, reading aloud. Any of those things are considered performance. And then negative interpretation, so taking uh, a unclear social cue and interpreting it negatively, um, instead of a person without social anxiety would experience someone walking away from them as they had something else to do, whereas a negative interpretation would be, they're angry at me or they think I'm stupid or something like that. Social competence, sorry, my dog is banging at the door. Social competence was measured as nervousness. So they did this by measuring, blushing, stuttering, things like that. And then temperament was also looked at as two of the five aspects of the big five temperament are neuroticism and extroversion, with a positive relationship with neuroticism. So if your social anxiety goes up or your neuroticism go up, or if you have extroversion, if you're extroverted, as your extroversion level goes up, the social anxiety should go down. So those are the two things that they looked at there. It's a longitudinal study of a non-clinical sample of adolescents, and it's a cohort study as well. So it's looked at 331 adolescents. In the initial assessment, they were between 9 and 17. So, and then they were looked at for the following 4 years, so it ended at 12 and 21. And so there was a longitudinal study as well as a cohort study in that sample of participants. They use self-report, teacher report, parent report, and an outside observer as different measures. So then they did, for the procedure, it was 4 waves of assessments. So the first, second, and third waves are the battery of tests, and then they're spaced 1 year apart. And then the fourth wave happened anywhere between 1 and 3 years after the third wave occurred. The parents and teachers filled out questionnaires during this, and then the adolescents were also asked to make a public speaking presentation where an outside observer measured their nervousness. So measured stuttering, blushing, sweating, lots of different measures of anxiety. So the measures they used for self-report were the Social Anxiety of Scale for Adolescents, Adolescence Interpretation and Brief Questionnaire, Focus Attention Questionnaire, and the Self-Report on Performance. So those were all given to the adolescents to fill out for themselves. And then the outside observer watched their presentation and filled out the performance questionnaire. And then the parents had to fill out the hierarchical personality inventory for children and the behavioral inhibition scale to inform on their temperament. And then the teachers did the Conners teacher rating scale, and the it's in Dutch there, but it's the questionnaire for social functioning to talk about their social competence. So for the data analysis, the trajectories of social anxiety was it was a little above my head in its statistics, honestly. They lost me. But what I did understand was they did use a control for the nonlinear trajectory with a developmental peak. So all adolescents go through that awkward phase and would have a peak of social anxiety, and they did control for that. What I figured out was they kind of took the numbers and ran them forward, did regressions forward, and then also did it backward, and that created the trajectories that they were able to find of the different levels of social anxiety. And then they did a multinomial logistic regression model for the predictive variables. So the results were they found 3 different trajectories, high and changing, moderate and decreasing, and low and decreasing. So they just kind of simplified it and went with high, moderate, and low. And they also found that with the variables, that some of the variables they thought would be factors were not. Specifically, negative interpretations and self-focused attention were definitely a distinct factor of the high, it discriminated between the high and low and the moderate trajectory. So um, those two were very important, as well as the social performance skills and social problems at school definitely discriminated between the high and moderate trajectories, and then the neuroticism reported on by the parents distinguished the low from the moderate trajectory. So those were the ones that seemed clinically significant or were statistically significant. So what this points to is the results are that they were able to find distinct trajectories of social anxiety, so that was successful, and that there is the high anxiety trajectory can be discriminated from moderate and low, um, and that this informs potential interventions of teaching social skills and increasing social competence to reduce negative interpretations and self-focus, to reduce high anxiety, and to hopefully intervene with the trajectory of a high social anxiety getting all the way to adulthood. Additionally, they talked about limitations. The sample size was definitely a limitation, and then that it was a cohort study design eliminated the ability to see cause and effect. So that is that study. And hopefully you have questions, and I look forward to answering them. Thank you very much.